Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Joshua Bassifin, the Director of Climate Action at Parliament of the World's Religions, and welcome to the first global conversation. This series of conversations came about through our Climate Commitments Project, which is a project that seeks to connect and convene folks from different faith, spiritual, and religious backgrounds across the world to facilitate knowledge sharing on climate change, particularly with a view towards what different communities are doing to mitigate climate change in the world. So we're really excited to have you here. This is an experiment with a global scope to see if we can kind of achieve some knowledge and resource sharing in a virtual space. So rather than a traditional webinar, which would have presentations and panels, this will be entirely conversational based. Now, the thing about having a global conversation is you run right smack into time zones. And so although this particular installment in the global conversations is really more suitable for the Americas, Africa, Europe, and maybe the Middle East, the next one will be more geared towards the Eastern Hemisphere, and so all of Asia. So anyone in North America who's an insomniac and wants to get on a global conversation at 3 in the morning, that might give you something to do. So watch out for that. I want to mention that we have 23 countries represented. And just to give you a sense of the diversity of geographical locations, I'm going to run through those really quickly. So Australia, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Brazil, Cameroon, Canada, Colombia, India, Israel, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Nepal, the Netherlands, Pakistan, Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland, Tajikistan, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, United Kingdom, and United States. So welcome to all of you from all over the globe. I want to recognize our co-sponsors for the Global Conversations, and those organizations are the Center for Earth Ethics, the Earth Day Network, Faith in the Common Good, Interfaith Power and Light, the Sustainable Energy Education and Knowledge Sharing Project, and Soka Gakkai International. And finally, before I introduce our conversationalists and get us off and running, I want to mention that there will be, as I said, more global conversations in the coming months. And that series will then culminate in April in a virtual Earth Day celebration that we are partnering on with Earth Day Network. So watch out for some communications about that. So the way this will work is we'll start a conversation with our 4 conversationalists, who I'll introduce in a moment, and we'll just kind of get going, and we'll have a few topics that we'll discuss. And then in the last 20 to 30 minutes, we'll have an opportunity for folks from the audience to join in on the conversation as well. So what I'd like you to do is, on your side panel in the GoToWebinar, you'll see a little thing called questions. And if you expand that, there's a place where you can write. And so if you're interested, towards the end of this session, to come in with any questions or comments, really anything you want, just write your name in that question box. And my colleagues here will organize so that we can have some folks come into the conversation as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our conversationalists. We have Amber Burgin, who's a health psychologist, young adult minister at Union Baptist Church in Durham, North Carolina, and the founder of Elijah's Farm, which seeks to grow quality produce while providing community education on food apartheid. We have Alexandra Goossens-Ishii, who's a program coordinator for the Soka Gakkai International Office for UN Affairs in Geneva. She supports Soka Gakkai's work on sustainable living through various non-formal education and advocacy efforts. We have Seven Kalyanju, who's the director of Green Muslims. She's a speaker, educator, master naturalist, and a roving interpreter leading watershed education experiences for grade school students. Finally, we have Rabbi Yonatan Nirel, who founded and directs the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development and its Jewish Eco-Seminars branch. Rabbi Nirel speaks internationally on religion and the environment and co-organized 12 interfaith environmental conferences in Israel and the US. So I'm going to start now by asking kind of a fundamental question for the work that we're doing at Parliament, which is on climate commitments. And when we talk about climate commitments, we're thinking about committing to actions in communities that are going to lower carbon footprints and ultimately move us forward on transitioning to a low carbon economy. So what I want to ask of folks in the beginning here is, what climate commitments have you and your community made in recent years? And I'm thinking about the areas of food, energy, advocacy, providing education and resources, transportation, and congregational greening, which would be lowering carbon footprints within the walls of our congregations. And maybe we'll start in the East, so to speak, and go to Rabbi Nirel, who is in Jerusalem.
So I can speak in regards to the synagogue that I'm a part of here in Jerusalem. There's on the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday, there's a practice called a kiddush, which is a small meal that is served after the prayer service. And this is a common practice in Jewish services around the world. And our synagogue has made an effort to use durable, non-disposable plates and cups and silverware instead of using disposable ones. We also don't serve meat at the kiddush, and it's easy to use disposables, as we know, but it's part of the spiritual practice of the core members in our synagogue to take the durable dishes that are used in this small meal that's served, and one person volunteers to take the dirty dishes and to wash them and to bring them back to the synagogue. So that's, in terms of our use of plastic, this is a small act, but I think it is noticed and is an important action in light of the plastic being a petroleum product and the disposal issues involved with disposing of plastic.
Thank you. I think what's really encouraging and interesting about that example is that you've incorporated a ritual, a traditional act into your sustainability practice, into your commitment to lowering your carbon and environmental footprint. And I know there's other traditions that have done that as well, that have kind of sought out how to engage in ritual in a sustainable way. And I wonder, Sevim, if you could speak to maybe like the Green Ramadan movement or the Green Hajj movement, which I know are becoming popular.
Okay, I remember to unmute myself. Green Ramadan came to mind immediately when I heard the rabbi's description. We actually have a small organization also in the Washington, D.C. area called Green Ramadan, and I work closely with the founder of that organization. But as many people will know, during the month of Ramadan, when Muslims across the globe are fasting, they also come together to break their fast every day for a month, and then there's a celebration for Eid at the end. We have big problems, at least speaking locally, of food waste and use of plastics and even styrofoam during that time, to a degree that people who are sensitive to such subjects don't even want to participate in those dinners. Little by little over the years, I know many Muslims who've made an effort to bring their own dishes to such events, but now it's individual mosques and Islamic centers where several members are attempting to make the shift to reusable plates and utensils and to discourage waste. But also, as I mentioned before, there is a small organization called Green Ramadan, which encourages individuals to bring their own plates and utensils. They sell them online at a reasonable price so that they will bring their own plates and utensils and not have to use any disposables. So the effort has started. We feel like we're still a long ways away, especially when it comes to the food waste that occurs during Ramadan. But it's happening as well. And I often see that, you know, starting at a smaller scale is sometimes more productive than trying to give a universal message. But as Green Muslims grows over time, we do hope to have more Ramadan events where we talk about these subjects while people are breaking their fast and start to pay attention to how much is being wasted. I know that Green Muslims many years ago, before I was leading it, had invested in reusable plates and utensils and was encouraging small private iftars to borrow those so that they wouldn't waste as much. So the voice is there. There's just still a lot of work to be done, but it's happening, and it seems to be growing every year. And education is key, of course. We have to talk to people about it so they start thinking about it, and that's where Green Muslims is most focused on, educating people about the impact that we're having and the little steps that we can take to make a big difference.
Thank you. Now, thinking about, I think that's a really good point about the educational component, especially when we consider that the Muslim world is about 25% of the whole world. And so, you know, it's so important to really involve Muslims from all over. And I think that's a great point about, you know, not just practicing Green Ramadan in your own community, but also providing education and resources. And I wonder, I know that Alexandra and Amber, you're both involved in education, providing education and resources in your community. So would you like to jump in here as well?
Amber?
Would you like to go first?
Okay, so then I will just go first. Thank you. So thank you very much for what you were sharing. Just a few points before education, we've observed same changes are really starting to happen as well in the seminars that we are holding, like really this move from really going away from plastic, reusable. So this is, I think it's concrete actions. In terms of Soka Gakkai's really long-standing commitments, it's definitely been education, around education. And so it's been really at the core of like what we use like as non-formal educational tools to really further discussion on our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to the environment, and how do we relate. So we have really been using, I would say, non-formal educational tools, exhibitions. We've used these exhibitions to create opportunities to meet and have gathering around local communities that will be organized by the local communities themselves with different settings. Sometimes it's with schools or universities, local governments, really involving intergenerational and a variety of actors. And so through these educational efforts, that there are especially 3 points that we've been building the tools on, which is really a focus on learning, which will lead to a focus on reflecting, bringing really reflection, leading to really empowerment, and then this has to lead to action. So that has been like the basis of our educational tools, really aiming at ultimately, discussing action, bringing action. What's been really interesting is the intergenerational component. You see children bringing their parents, or parents bringing their children. And then that really is leading to a discussion on changes at various levels. Could be within the family, could be then at school, children bringing the topics to school. So we've been, really taking this commitment on education.
And we should say that for those who don't know, so Soka Gakkai is what's self-described as an engaged Buddhist organization, right? And so when you talk about going from reflection, which is a very important concept in Buddhism, the idea of self-reflection, right? Going from reflection through into engagement and into action, that's sort of the trajectory that you use, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's how the change in the self will also lead then to a greater change in the community.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Amber.
Yes, good morning. These are great questions. So in my community, I think it should be clarified that my primary focus in the work that I do is primarily with underserved communities, and in particular in my area, Black and Latinx minority communities. And so we focus on utilizing faith-based institutions, not just churches, but synagogues and mosques, to provide education for those particular groups to start particularly thinking about the ways in which they could use less resources and become more sustainable. At my particular church, I serve at a church called Union Baptist. It's a fairly large urban church in Durham, North Carolina. One of the things that we're focusing on in the young adult ministry that I am responsible for is how to educate our multi-generational group of people in our church on how to become more sustainable through not just the awareness of climate change, but also in the ways in which they live their daily lives. And so our focus this year has been on food conservation and thinking about food apartheid. So we've been focusing at our church on creating a garden, but in addition to that, have worked with a grant group to provide supplies for container gardens for other churches and faith-based organizations within our catchment area. So that's the highlight of what we've been doing lately, which has been surprisingly difficult. You would think that more people would be excited about getting free resources to do something that seems extremely simple, as like growing a vegetable, as a change to create change in the climate. But what we've discovered is that generationally, there are a lot of differences in the ways in which people relate to the ideas of climate change. Like you were saying earlier, so the younger people, like my child is 8 and he's extremely interested in climate change. And so the idea of a container garden for him is extremely exciting. People in my mother's generation, she's a baby boomer, have come from the farm in my community. And so they have a resistance to going back to agriculture. And then people in my generation, because their parents are baby boomers, don't really have a deep relationship with agriculture, nor do they really take the time to consider where their food comes from and how that relationship between food creates a stronger carbon footprint. So we're focusing on developing education for those different intergenerational groups so that we can eventually come to the middle with our needs for sustainability.
Amber, do you ever do farm to table meals? Because I think one of the things that can really hook people, you know, in local agriculture is when they see the fruits of their labor being served to them in really delicious meals.
Absolutely, farm to table is one of my favorite things because our particular area does not have enough. There's only one urban garden in our community, and so the farm to table activities there are designed to appear community friendly. But as we know, systemically in the United States, regentrification is tied to community gardens. And so the people who are advertised to and it appeals to are primarily from the group of people who are regentrifying the neighborhood. and not necessarily creating access for persons who may necessarily see themselves as an identifying character within the community garden. So as we continue to develop container gardens at different churches, our spring concept is for everyone to bring their different vegetables and the things that they're working on together so that we can have a community farm to table meal. And I think hopefully when we get our vegetables in, that should be a pretty dope idea. We've been working with another group in our area to kind of work with other teams, because there's another interfaith group here called Durham CAN. That's an interfaith group that also focuses on agriculture. And there is a gentleman who has a private organization called War for Life. It's actually a suicide prevention program. And his focus on suicide prevention is proper nutrition. He says that if you start with proper food in your community and you eliminate environmental pollution, people are less likely to commit suicide. So we work with him, and he has a grant to build greenhouses. And so he's been building greenhouses in different community agencies in our catchment area. And so the goal is for all of us to collaborate in the spring to do a farm to table meal. So it's exciting. Yeah.
I think one of the things I love about community gardening and local agriculture as a climate commitment is there's so many ways that you're reducing your carbon footprint, right? So you're reducing the transportation, and the food getting to you. You're putting more plant-based foods into your diet, because most people aren't going to raise a cow or a goat in a community garden. It's usually going to be vegetables, maybe some chickens. Right. And it's all right there next to you. And as I think you said so beautifully, really engaging with the community. And I love that idea of having a community-wide meal together, not just the folks who historically have been privileged enough to have access to local gardening. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. My current work is I have a multitude of jobs, but I actually run a farm called Elijah's Farm. And one of the things that we're focused on is developing videos for social media shorts, so that as people pick up a vegetable that they've never seen before, can find a link and go to a video that shows them not just how to cook that vegetable in a very cool way, but also creates an opportunity for us to put in other health information. So for example, we just finished our planning for our video on how to cook celery, because even though celery is a simple vegetable that you see all the time in the grocery store, most of the people in my generation, when I ask even my friends, hey, what do you guys do with celery? They have no idea what to do with celery. So we made a basic video, and while we were cooking the celery and putting it in things like chicken salad or tuna fish or pot roast, things that they like to eat but they don't know how to cook, we're also talking about other things that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. Some of the videos are intergenerational, so we've got older generations and younger generations talking about what it looks like to take your parent to the doctor, what kind of questions that need to be asked, so that the farm doesn't just shift our climate situation, but also our general health overall.
Mm-hmm. I want to give.
And it's back.
Oh no, sorry. I just want to say I want to give other folks here an opportunity to talk as well about food and agriculture and any ways that your communities are engaging in that way with that tool. Or we can move on.
I'll share that.
Okay.
First of all, it's hailing now in Jerusalem. I don't know if you can hear it in the microphone, but there's about 70 community gardens in Jerusalem, and it's an initiative of people, many of them, people who go to houses of worship and pray, to make agriculture more local in the city. So it's a very encouraging initiative. Although with climate change, the rain has become much more erratic. And so there's longer periods of dryness here, including the worst drought in 900 years. followed by intense periods of short periods of rain, like what's happening, just started about 5 minutes ago. And actually the roof is leaking because it's so intense. So that's just, you know, the reality here in the Eastern Mediterranean region.
Yeah. So we have to think about, you know, the changing climate, which changes weather patterns, which changes how we use the land and where we can actually grow food, which is another important consideration. So one of the things that was interesting in that round we just went through was, you know, when I asked what your community's climate commitments are, most of you kind of were thinking about them through the lens of your tradition, right? So sort of your own rituals, or your kind of philosophy in the world that your tradition gives you. And I wanted to do like a total 180 and ask, what is the role of the interfaith movement in making climate commitments and implementing climate commitments and really bringing folks together? So I'll just say, as a kind of precursor to that question, that one of the things that inspires me personally in the work that I do is, you know, statistically something like 80% of the world is affiliated with some sort of religious, spiritual, or indigenous tradition. That's about 6.5 billion people. And as far as I know, almost all of those traditions teach something about the moral obligation to protect our planetary home. You know, we might call it different things, but that's our planet. And so our ability to aggregate those people in the world and to amplify their messages from their traditions about the obligation to protect the planet, I think could be a game changer. And so I wonder how you all have engaged. And I know some of you have more, some of you have a little bit less engaged in interfaith, but what you think is the role of interfaith in mobilizing on climate.
Can I share something?
Please.
Yeah, so I'm currently at the COP 25 in Madrid, and there was a side event yesterday or the day before that was actually an interfaith event, and I felt that the title was Inspiring Courage and Action, and it was really the interfaith coalition of several faith-based organizations gathering different faith-based organizations, but also scientists, UN officials, and even government representatives. And the question to all of them was really, what is inspiring you to act, and what is inspiring courage? And it was really interesting because I could feel that it was thanks to the interfaith effort that all these perspectives could be brought together. Because probably with the faith-based background, there is this, as you mentioned, Joshua, there is this ethical or moral kind of call to action in a way that really led this coalition of faith-based or interfaith organizations to really like gather voices from the UN, from scientists that would probably not really talk to each other or not that much. And it actually brought the conversation back to something very humane. What is inspiring each person to act? And one of the results, and I would say then, I think where interfaith is really playing a role in my mind is I think it really because it brings also this ethical component, maybe the idea of solidarity. I think by the end of the conversation, almost all the panelists spoke of the hope that they had after this event as well. I think that's a very important point, especially being at the COP right now. Some people, they really share how it can be overwhelming, becoming so technical. And I think maybe interfaith brings really us back to hope as well.
If I may go ahead and add, there's the ethical component and the hope, but what I've seen from my own experiences, which excite me very much because it links back to my own personal experience of having grown up Muslim in a community where there was not really a Muslim community, but I was surrounded by trees and a lake and nature. There's also a spiritual component that I'm finding all faith traditions can share when it comes to nature. Connecting with nature, caring for nature, and then ultimately taking care of the environment. I recently participated in an interfaith nature walk at Watershed Forum for the Chesapeake Bay watershed here in my region, and it was so popular, and I loved it. I can't wait to do it again because I listened to the other representatives. Some were faith leaders, some were lay people like myself. I listened to them share their understandings of the connection between their faith and nature. And it was all about how the earth is a book of God and the signs of God are in it. And I was in tears because for the longest time, I thought I was one of very few people who saw it that way. So the spiritual component, although I understand it's not everybody's path, it actually can be very strong. And there are more people out there than I realized who can share that understanding that I've always held, whether they consider themselves to be people of faith or not. Oftentimes there's still some spirituality involved in people's concerns and moral values. And so this is the first step, having a connection with nature and a concern for nature, which ultimately I would hope lead to greater climate action in the long run. But it's the path that excites me the most personally, and I hope to pursue it more with more of these interfaith nature walks.
So I know Amber and Rabbi Nirel have been doing interfaith work as well.
I was going to say, absolutely. Can you hear me okay? I hear a frequency in the background. Okay. I love this conversation. One of the things that came to mind as we started talking about the concept of interfaith is something that one of my favorite professors said to me once. His name is Dr. Cologne Emmerich at Duke Divinity School. And he talked about seeing stewardship of the earth as a symphony, and how each component of nature, from trees and dirt and animals and insects, but also to the caring of people and people caring for the stewardship of the earth, in itself is a symphony. And that if there's a piece missing, that the symphony is off. And so when I think about interfaith conversations about conservation and the concept of collectivism in the way that we seek to steward the earth, I oftentimes think about what a beautiful thing it is to do the work together from an interfaith perspective, as if we were an orchestra. And so when I think about the work that we do, not just at my institutional job, but also in my work as a minister, I think it's our duty as people of faith to work collectively. Because I think morally, all of us are coming from the same foundation of love and grace. And I think if we are willing to look at stewardship from that perspective, without the necessity of denomination or religion as a foremarker for how we engage in the stewardship of the earth, I think that eradicates the limitations. Seeing people as people who are all stewards of the same space, and teaching that as the foundation, as opposed to primarily focusing on biblical interpretation, I think is very important.
If you don't mind, I'd like to add on that, just in terms of interfaith work. I've been involved with more direct interfaith work at a personal level years ago, where it seemed to just be people talking about their own faith to teach others about their own beliefs. What I found with interfaith climate work or these nature walks, or even the youth program that Green Muslims hosted last summer, which was an interfaith program, we no longer have to talk directly about, oh, I am Muslim and I believe this, and then compare and contrast. We actually have a common theme to work with, and we share from our hearts and our actions. And of course, we're always free to vocally share our beliefs too, but the commonalities just come out so much faster. And that's just been a beautiful experience that I've observed. I mean, the similarities, I've always believed the similarities between the faith traditions outweighed the differences. But when you're focused on a theme like protecting the planet that we all live on together and that we feel obligated to protect, it's amazing. It's really amazing.
And I find too that when we focus on people being people and make a theme around that, about people finding connectivity amongst their humanity and not the differences in their religion, people are more willing to focus on what we're talking about, as opposed to, like, the word interfaith, it draws a particular group of people into the conversation. But once they get to the conversation or they get to the activity, whatever the interfaith concept was is gone, and it's just people coming together with a common ground. And I think that, but then they get to take that back to their diverse interfaith groups as an idea that then spreads denominationally across every group. And I love that about interfaith conversations, interfaith nature walks. I'd love to see us do something like an interfaith farm to table dinner, because I think that that would make a huge difference as well.
That sounds amazing. So I want to just pause really briefly because we have another conversationalist who's joining us now, just a little bit late. And I want to introduce him and bring him into the party. And that is Gauranga Das, who's a leader in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He's a teacher, he's an academician, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's in academics, a speaker, and the way I know him is as the director of the Govardhan Ecovillage, where he does a whole lot of things, but in the vein of implementing sustainable green initiatives in the Govardhan village near Mumbai, India. So welcome, Gauranga Das. Can you hear us? You are unmuted. And so we should be able to hear you if you're talking, but maybe we'll give you a minute. And if you can, turn your webcam on, and that'll allow us to see you. And so we'll continue on, and hopefully you'll be able to talk to us and hear from us. So Rabbi Nirel, you are the director of the an interfaith sustainability organization. And so in this discussion about interfaith, I wonder if you have thoughts, because I know you've been working on the ground in Israel, in the Middle East, with folks from different traditions. I think mostly Abrahamic traditions, if I'm not mistaken. But I wonder, what lessons you've learned from your interfaith work that you can tell us about how we might best engage in the interfaith movement for climate change.
That's a great question. I oscillate between being encouraged and discouraged in this work. I'm encouraged, as Reverend Amber was saying, about the power of religion as the largest NGO in the world, with 85% of people identifying with religion, and really the only force in the world that I think can stand up to consumer society, which is, probably the strongest force in the world, and in many ways eclipses religion in modern society, with the cathedrals of malls and movie houses, etc. I also am troubled by the the acquiescence and perhaps embrace of many religious people and even clergy and religious institutions with theology of prosperity and of wealth and abundance, which embraces this idea that as Genesis 1:20, chapter 1, verse 28 says, that God said, "Fill the earth and conquer it and dominate the fish and the birds and the animals," and based on that, therefore understand that we can essentially do whatever we want to planet Earth and to everything on it, and that God has given us a carte blanche to extract as we wish and to degrade the Earth, and it's all for the good, and that somehow God will save us from any degradation that occurs, or if not God, then in different traditions, however that's understood, as whether it's, the prophet or the Messiah or whatever it is, that somehow we're gonna, that God is sort of believes that we should just do whatever we want, and it's a theology that I found is fairly widespread among people in many different religions. Doesn't relate to any one religion or any denomination, and to be honest, since you, Alexandra, are at COP25, which by the name is the 25th attempt of the world's nations to come together to find an agreement on climate change. And when they started doing that in 1992 in Rio, global emissions were half what they are today. So it's sort of amazing that, despite 25 attempts and 27 years of humanity trying to come to an agreement and to decrease emissions, that actually emissions rise every year, and as they're predicted to do for the coming decades. And I think part of that has to do with the lack of an adequate religious response to the ecological crisis, that it's not actually about climate change or fossil fuels at a deeper, or even consumerism at a deeper level. It's about greed and finding our real pleasure in life in the physical, versus the solutions that religion offers of long-term thinking, caring for the other, caring for God's creation and other species. And that's really, I think part of the work of mobilizing religion to get on board in addressing the ecological crisis.
Absolutely, this is probably my buzzword when we talk about the interpretation of the Bible when it comes to stewardship. Because prosperity gospel is definitely something that is very rampant, particularly in Black and Brown communities when it comes to faith in the United States. There's a book, it's called Blessed by Kate Boulder. And it's a white woman who takes a journey into the Black church and talks about how regularly the concept of favor is used to, I would say, manipulate persons in their faith to see the world a particular way, where prosperity is based on commercial goods and capitalism, in comparison to considering what it is to live humbly, to walk humbly on the earth, to care for the earth as the most important thing, instead of us as the individual being the most important thing. And what I love about her concept, and especially what you're talking about, is how the work of climate change, I think, for people of faith, begins with our interpretation of our scriptures. What are we teaching, as a part of our communities within our faith-based organizations, about how God instills in us the requirement of taking care of the earth, primarily as a component of our faith and not as a secondary act. And I think because we don't spend time doing that, we have a large group of people who see the earth as a space that is usable, but not something that we must care for. And I think especially because for 25 years, we've been trying to figure out how to manage climate change. And at no point in time have we just thought maybe we should just stop doing some things. We're still trying to figure out how to get around. And I think it's rooted primarily in how, if 85% of the world participates in a faith, and that faith practice does not make stewardship of the earth a priority, then it will never be a priority. And I think that's something that we as people of faith need to really consider when we think about how we teach about our faith.
That's the disconnect between what our faith and spiritual tradition teaches us about protecting the earth and our behavior on the earth is a fascinating one. And there is a real disconnect, as Rabbi Nirel said, that we have these patterns of consumption that have been instilled in us for generations, overconsumption, overconsumption, and yet we really disregard, what we're taught. And in the Buddhist tradition, there's the idea of being an ascetic, right? Of kind of foregoing some of the pleasures of the world for a higher spiritual purpose. And I wonder, Alex, if you have some thoughts on consumption from a Buddhist perspective.
I completely agree with this conversation is really interesting. But yeah, in the Buddhist thinking, there is at the root of attachments as well is what we call 3 poisons, and one of them is greed. And I think for me personally, really starting to learn about that made me start to reflect on my own practices, and also realizing sometimes my own incoherences between what I'm trying to practice and actually my behavior on day to day, no? And so I think that what also Reverend Amber, you were also saying is like reflecting on how we use our teachings and how then we share it is so important, because it's ultimately about we can change systems, but if ultimately the heart never changes, we'll go back in circle. So I think, for me, the Buddhist perspective of these 3 poisons leading to attachments really help me reflect on why I have this attachment. And I think then I also really agree with Rabbi Nero about then religion being this really probably the only or strongest force or power, really being able to counter this greed or attachment in a way, like with this probably providing I don't know if I would say explanation, but not explanation, because there will be different according to, or the perspectives might be different depending. So it's not as a truth, I mean, but like, providing like understanding, a tool to take action, to make a determination about it, and to definitely reflect and on a strong grounding, I would say. I would like to add one more thing that I'm thinking is like, so there is this in Buddhism, there is this idea of like understanding where attachment comes from, with this root, the 3 poison, and greed being one of them. But what also I really like, and where I find it very applicable in daily life, is that it's also using everything that is happening in daily life to transform it into value, which then at a personal level helps me dealing with the reality in which we are now. If not, sometimes it might be overwhelming, or it might be like a solution might be to go out of this reality. I think it's at a personal level, it's bringing me a tool to act.
That's great. Oh, please go ahead, Severin.
Sure. I was just going to add a small thought, because as a layperson, I'm reluctant to say what's been said, but I mean I'm nodding vigorously. I totally agree with the comments that were made, but in my own efforts, because I don't see myself in a position to try to influence the general interpretation of the faith directly, I've sought to, well, for one thing, I like working with children best of all, because there's still room for change and development. But I have to ask myself, why do I care? And I care because I developed an intimate connection with nature. And so I wonder what role just, again, environmental education and exposure to nature can play in learning to care about the entire earth. And if you love it, you're going to care for it. Again, going back to that interfaith walk, it was just so amazing to hear the similarities in interpretation between the representatives of the different faith perspectives. And one thing each and every one of us said was that our religions teach that this earth is a book of God, and that the signs of God are in it, and that we can learn our faith perspectives by studying nature. And if you start with that perspective, surely you understand that you even though you can always quote some verses from our holy books that say we are in charge of the earth and we are the ones who can do whatever we want with it, it can be interpreted that way. But if you love it, that means that we are the ones who are responsible for it and must care for it and protect it and respect it. Yeah, just I'm so impressed to hear the similarities in interpretations. But I myself, I'm wondering if I can stay focused on youth and helping them appreciate nature so that they recognize these problems that were just described.
That's maybe a good segue to another topic that I wanted to talk about with you guys, which is very timely when thinking about youth and the role of youth and the future of the people who are right now youth. You know, as we've all seen very strongly, the youth climate movement has been really gaining steam, and you know, the context around that is that we know that we're at the tipping point right now, right? We know that we're staring down the barrel at the point of no return. We've got 10 years. We've got to quintuple the commitments that countries have made. Alexandra's at COP25. She's hearing those conversations right this week as we speak, you know, that we are at that point of no return. And the youth are woke, as they say. You know, they see that more clearly than any of us, and they are starting to engage in direct action. Right? They're not going to write papers in school about it. They're going to start going to the streets, and there is a tradition of direct action in a lot of different religions, and direct action has brought about change. You know, historically. In a lot of places, in a lot of countries, in India, during the wresting from British control in the American South, and those were really, you know, those were at least, you know, those were leaders who were at least affiliated with religion in some way. And so I wonder if you guys can talk a little bit about the role of direct action historically. Actually, Sevim and I were talking about this beforehand, and she was asking, are we talking about direct action just on climate? And I said yes, but now I've changed my mind because I think really it's the concept of direct action, like how your tradition thinks about direct action and how the philosophy of using direct action. I wonder if you all can comment on that from your perspectives.
Maybe I can share on this. This is Gauranga. Can you hear me now?
Hello, Gauranga, welcome. Yes, we can hear you, please.
Yeah, I'm actually now on the audio call through the phone, so probably it's clear. So anyway, maybe I can just share in this that the concept of Govardhan Ecovillage, which started sometime in the year 2009, actually it was a output of around 30 youths, 30 monks, who were in the age group of 25 to 35. They all went in the middle of a forest and they created this whole eco-village. So the whole eco-village was, I would just continue to the answer to previous question also, that in the Vedic tradition of India, one of the concepts is that everything is cyclical in nature. So in other words, any waste which comes out of a particular system is used as an input to another system. So in this way, the waste not only is ecologically good, but it also creates an economic value. So we tried this thing in the Govardhan Ecovillage, and we termed it as symbiotic recycling. So whichever waste which are produced in our community, in a typical way, there are 5 kinds of waste produced. There is the wet waste, like food waste, animal waste. And there is the dry waste, like the leaves, the paper, the foliage. Then there is the plastic waste, which could be due to the visitors coming. Then there is construction waste due to the construction of buildings or any kind of huts or whatever. And then there is sewage, human waste. So what we did in our community is that we tried to create systems such that each of these waste, when it is processed through the system, it creates an economic value. So as a result, our community, we tried to make it zero waste community by processing all this. And now, with the help of all these youths, we are now trying to extend this to the nearby villages by helping them, by educating and facilitating the villagers to adopt these practices which are safe for Mother Earth and nature. So these two teachings, one is that things are cyclical and waste can create an economic value. And secondly, Earth in our Vedic tradition is considered to be Mother, because she is supposed to be the consort of the Lord, and therefore we must respect Mother Earth. Based on these two teachings, when these are clear in the mind of a youth, and he is automatically driven to serve. And so this principle has worked very well in our community, and also helping others even of different faith. Because in villages you get people of all different faith, but when they see a genuine desire of service, then they are moved and they cooperate and they are benefited. So I just thought I would share this with all of yourselves.
Thank you, Gauranga Das. That's beautiful. I love the idea of reusing materials as a radical act, because that kind of connects to the conversation we were having before about consumerism, and it's instilled in us to just use and use and use, and to take and use and then throw away. And I know that in India there's an entire industry that's formed around informal recycling, and it's such a beautiful tradition, and it really is a radical act, and something that comes from a real place of love. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to join in here?
I was just going to say, I am participating in a program this summer where we're going to Cuba. And for 4 weeks, we're going to be spending time in Cuba learning about sustainable practices. And one of those practices is reusing things. And it's such an abstract concept for people who are born and raised in America, because that's not the first thing that we think about. And now that I'm running a farm, it's something that I think about every day, all the way down to like the clothes that we outgrow. How can I use this on the farm? And so eliminating the idea that beauty is perfect or that beauty is extremely organized and neat. Like the farm to me at first looked messy because I felt like I needed to buy all new stuff. It needed to be pretty and perfect. And so when we decided we were going to build our own greenhouse as a part of us becoming like part of the relationship with the earth. And as we were doing that, the first thing I thought was, we could probably find this wood somewhere else. And the act of meeting my neighbor who had this extra unclaimed wood made a huge difference in the connectivity of our community, especially because I'm new to my neighborhood. And so now when people come to the farm, I no longer feel like reusing looks messy. Reusing is, I think, probably one of the most beautiful things about what it is to have a farm. When you look back, like I went looking for pallets the other day because pallets are so hard to find. And I went to 6 different places, met 6 different people from the community, picked up pallets, made a compost pile. And in the midst of doing so, was reclaiming things from the earth that had been used over and over and over again. And started thinking very similarly to what you were talking about. How do we teach that as beauty? How do we teach the reusing of things as what it is to have favor? Like the gift of being able to have things that can be reclaimed. And so I'm excited about that as a concept. I'm excited about the shift that it would take in order for people to think about the reusing of things as stewardship. Especially because for me as a personal journey, recycling, particularly in communities where people are poor, if to recycle, it sends a message of you don't have enough to buy something new. And so trying to teach people in the community that everything does not have to be new for you as an individual to be okay is not just like a stewardship thing, but it's also a psychological concept. Trying to teach people that they are okay without capitalism in America in particular is very hard. And so to hear you talk about the beauty of that, I think is very inspiring.
I just like to pick up on what Reverend Amber said, and I'm finding that I have a lot in common with my fellow clergy of faith, which is always encouraging and one of the great parts of interfaith sustainability work. There's a Jewish teaching about Jacob that when he was coming back to the land of Israel to meet his brother Esau, so Esau came with a 400-man militia, presumably to kill him. And Jacob put his family on the other side of the Jabbok stream, that's today Jordan. And the Jewish tradition asks, well, what was he doing? The Bible says that he was left alone. How could it be that he left his family alone at that critical moment? And the Jewish tradition says that he went back for a few small vessels. And according to the mystical tradition, the reason he went back for a few vessels before meeting his brother was because he realized that everything in his possession had meaning, and that it was his responsibility as a spiritual being to raise up the physical and not to discard of anything prematurely. And that, even to the extent of potentially endangering his family at that key moment. And so that's a Jewish teaching that relates to spirituality and sustainability, and essentially trying to raise up the physical through long-term use of durable products. People don't realize the resources that go into clothing, for example. Most clothing is actually synthetic, and most non-synthetic clothing is cotton, and cotton requires a huge amount of water to produce it, and oftentimes pesticides. There's a tremendous ecological footprint from every piece of clothing that we wear, and so therefore there's a religious imperative to use that clothing to the greatest extent possible. And when we buy new clothing, we can buy it secondhand because there's such an abundance of used clothing that's available, that's good, that's like new. And there's actually not really a need to buy it. And when our clothing gets ripped, we can repair it. We don't need to throw it out.
I think that's when we get into the intersection of climate change, interfaith, but also like practical teaching. My mother grew up on a farm, and so my mother taught me what it looks like to like mend a garment, how to put a button on, how to put denim patches on the inside of your jeans. And that's an art that's lost. The idea of taking your shoes to a shoe person that can repair your shoes is a lost art, and it's particularly where I'm from, where you have all these shoes, and if they don't fit anymore, if the heel breaks, people just throw them away and buy new ones without ever thinking about the fact that like this is a resource that's been used, that we cannot, particularly because a lot of our manufactured clothing isn't natural, so it's produced with chemicals. Recognizing that those things are not going to break down in a landfill. Recognizing that as cute as it is, and as much as it makes us feel a certain way, we're also in the perspective that I come from, we're sinning, inadvertently, I think sometimes not thinking about the idea that in wearing this outfit, I have also produced a large carbon footprint. But yet my grandmother and my grandfather, for them, what I think is so interesting about this conversation in general is that we're talking about climate change as if climate change is a thing that is just new. My ancestors, my grandparents' grandparents were farmers and slaves. And so they understood we have to maintain, we have to take care of the earth, we have to protect the water because it was survival. food was the community, if there wasn't, industrial practices that kept things clean, there wasn't going to be anything for anyone. And so when we separate the conversation about climate change from the idea of survival, I think it's very interesting that we don't see those two things as intergrained concepts. We're teaching people about something that should, I feel like, be a natural thing, and for some reason it's not. Climate change is survival. If we don't, that cute outfit that we're wearing is not going to matter, because we're not going to be able to breathe. We're not going to be able to eat. We're not going to be able to have water. And so trying to teach people what the true reality of basic needs are is like trying to redefine Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Maslow, but he has this chart where it talks about your basic needs in order to get to self-actualization. And the idea that protecting the environment or taking care of where you live isn't part of the hierarchy of needs, to me, it's fascinating, and it speaks to how psychologically we have an aversion to the idea of reusing. We have an aversion to the idea that what we have is enough and we have to use it to its maximum.
Beautiful. So we've been having this conversation for about an hour now. I'm so hesitant to move into the next section because this has been such a dynamic and interesting conversation, and thank you all so much for this. But we do have quite a few people who would like to join us from the audience, and that is something that we want to do as well. And so I do want to note also for anyone who in the audience who does want to join us that this is being recorded, and so just a disclaimer there. We are recording this for purposes of doing a short report on the global conversation. So I'm going to bring in Aziz Nathu for a question or comment. You have the floor, Aziz.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my comment is that we tend to empower those that we choose to feed. So we have a plethora of organizations and giant companies that thrive on destroying the climate and our environment. And maybe we should have a running list of these violators so we can avoid giving them the oxygen and the funding they need to keep on doing what they do. And just have our own boycott and just spread the word. Essentially, evil succeeds when good people do nothing. So let's do something. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Aziz. I like that idea. I particularly like the imagery of those who thrive are those who we feed, and there isn't really a connected global boycott of the industries that that we're feeding, and yet who have the biggest carbon footprints. I mean, one of the things we should mention is the divestment movement has been making some strides, and particularly in some traditions like the Catholic tradition, more and more archdioceses and elements of the Catholic institution have been divesting. They've, I think, shown some leadership there. Also the Episcopal Church. But that's, I would welcome comments from our conversationalists about the divestment movement, and where you see, as our questioner asked, the need to kind of deny feeding the hand that's poisoning us.
Well, very quickly, I have to admit that Green Muslims has not focused much on the divestment movement up till now, and maybe our organizations need to be more involved, supporting it, teaching people about it. I'm sure there are many people who are not fully aware, so that's something that I need to make a note of, and something that we can talk about. in our community. So thank you for the question, for the comment.
I was going to
One
say,
of
I
the
think
ways,
that
Please go.
it sounded like you were going to say something, so I stopped. Were you going to finish your statement?
Yeah, so no,
Yeah.
I just say that. Oh, sorry, you wanted to speak?
There's a call. It sounds like there's a person trying to speak on the phone. And so I wanted to
Yeah.
pause.
You can go ahead. That's fine.
Oh, okay, thanks. One of the issues that I find with the divestment movement within the context of my community is that my community in general has such a high need that comes from these organizations that to tell people in my community to divest from these things without providing resources for them to sustain themselves without those things would be a problem, which is part of the reason why there are so many, particularly low-income Black communities that are, although very aware of some of the things that are going on when it comes to climate and the different organizations that participate in harming our environment, telling someone, you know, hey, you've got to stop. Even something as simple as like, we should divest from my Black community context. Let's divest from hair products that, you know, have issues with the climate. Let's divest from particular food companies that are utilizing space and resources that are bad for the environment in the middle of a food desert where psychologically hair care for Black people is very important, leaves a hole. And we don't have enough resources within the community and enough people focusing on how to resolve those issues to give people the forethought to go, yeah, let's do that. Because we're literally asking people, change your way of life and have nothing to resolve the hole that's missing. And so I think when we talk about the conversation about divestment, we've also got to talk about sustainability. How do we teach people to live without the things that they did not realize that they could live without before we push, particularly not just, you know, individuals, but interfaith groups as well, where the culture of the group is rooted in the environment with which they live.
Such a good point. Alex, I think you wanted to say something too, right?
Yeah, no, I actually, yeah, I agree with what you just shared. I know that UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, has been really reaching out to faith communities very actively in a deep discussion about divestment as well, and that's also definitely one of the points that is important to I guess encompass in its complexity is that I think it also has to be action has to be also taken at in a way at local community level, because it involves so many actors in so many different ways, about exactly what you were sharing, Reverend Amber, that there can be so many unintended consequences, and there will be, but to be able to have like the depth of that is required for this kind of conversation, it needs involving all the actors, or it needs to happen at a more local level, I would say. So yeah, no, I just wanted to add that point.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring in another person now, and that's going to be Charlene Manuel. We're going to unmute you, and please join our conversation.
My question was basically when Alexandra was talking about greed as one of the three poisons, my curiosity just came up where what are the other two? And I just, because I didn't know if they were related to climate change or whatever. So what are the other two poisons out of the three that you mentioned that you begin to talk about?
Hi, thank you. So yes, there is ignorance, as could be also foolishness that comes inherently as not being aware of one's unlimited potential and therefore unlimited potential of every other being. So ignorance, and there is anger as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. All right, moving right along. We're going to try and get as many folks in as possible. Next, we have David Hales, who happens to be the chair of the Climate Action Task Force at Parliament of World Religions. Welcome, David.
Good morning, Josh. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, you guys are terrific. I have a couple of questions, but let me focus on one of them that is very relevant to the Climate Action Task Force and the work of the Parliament. You've talked a little bit about the youth movements and about direct action. Quite often we have folks who are like me, the boomers, or even pre-boomers, who are uncomfortable with direct action. We even have people on the Parliament Task Force who don't want us to use pictures of protest movements because they think those are somehow off-putting to people that we'd like to engage in the process. And I'm wondering how, whether you guys are seeing in your work this generational split with a great deal of comfort between direct action on the part of especially young people and a bit of an aversion to it on the part of older people, and how you deal with that in your daily work.
I'd love to speak to that. Is that okay? I have recently become what's considered an urban farmer. And so there's a lot of buzz about young Black farmers becoming like a new and up and coming thing. And when they say that, you would think, oh, it's like hundreds of us that are trying this at one time. No, it's really like one of us per state trying to find the other one. And so when we were thinking about organization and organizing, opening a farm is, to me, as a womanist scholar, an act of revolution. To grow food is one of the greatest acts of revolution that you can have. And so in your mind, you would think that the older generations, like you were saying, would be excited to partner with a young person who actually cares about, learning the old traditions of farming, understanding how to make things grow. But what I find on an everyday basis is there seems to be an aversion, and I don't think that the aversion is really about not wanting to support young people in climate change work. I think the aversion has more to do with the differences in the way that we communicate and how our communication differences make each other feel. And I do a lot of that work at my church because we have a very large church, and so we have lots of intergenerational conversations that are going very wrong. And so the first thing that we did was we had a conversation about how baby boomers communicate differently than traditionalists, that communicate differently than Generation Xers, that communicate differently than millennials like myself, and Generation Zers, which are the group behind us, and how through our differences, there are also similarities. So we talk about the whys and how we got to this point. I think part of the reason why we have so many baby boomers who are not interested in supporting the actions and the direct actions of young people has more to do with feeling left out and not feeling like they were consulted based on their previous experiences doing the same thing. Because let us not forget that baby boomers were during the time of the civil rights movement. So they are participatory, many of them, in these same actions. My mother's comment about these things has been that sometimes baby boomers have a guilt that they don't want to talk about because they thought that their actions and the work that they did during that movement was going to shift the world so greatly that to see their children and their children's children working on trying to do the exact same thing makes them feel slight guilt and also resentment. Now, that's not my assumption for every person that's a baby boomer, but I do think that there's some merit to the idea that in the midst of this difference in communication and the way that we live and see the world, that there's also a sense of, one, being misunderstood, and two, having an internal sense of, we thought we got it right, We didn't. And now look what's happening. To that as well, young people like myself and my counterparts have people call it radicalism. I don't necessarily think that we're radical at all to have direct action. So much as I think we oftentimes think, well, why do we have to go through so much red tape to actually get something done? Like if we have a problem with climate change and food will help resolve that, then let's just grow some food. Not let's talk about the bureaucratic tape that has to go through, well, what are we going to do about this? And why can't I just go ask somebody who knows how to do it, and then do it? But when that happens and we come for help, we first have to hear, I call it the 10 miles in the snow conversation, where what first has to be heard, particularly when I'm talking with older generations, it's all of how they felt about their experience. And they only want to talk about the successes, but nobody ever wants to talk about the failures. And the failures are really what needs to be spoken about, because the mistakes that we made then are the same mistakes that we're going to make now if we don't. But baby boomers and older generations are so resistant to talking to these young, radical, excited people in climate change that somewhere in the midst of the conversation, the need of what we're doing gets lost, and the focus becomes more on trying to make people feel comfortable. So I think with that reality in mind, both younger generations and older generations have to be willing to communicate with each other in a way that makes sense for the other person. It's kind of like the 5 love languages. It's, to me, if they had a book about the 5 communications, we would be able to say, okay, this person needs to be heard before they can share, or this person gets excited and they need to get their idea out, and they need to feel supported in that idea, even if we don't always agree with every tenet. And if we focused more on how people's communications are different, we could get the point across and get the support that we need. But I think that that's hard because we don't teach communication. We teach how to do public speaking, but we don't talk about interpersonal communication very often. And I think that often becomes the barrier.
I want to just yes, please, Gauranga.
I would just like to share one point, which is just following up with what she said regarding the method of communication. In probably my experience, in the beginning, when you start making some change in the society with some experienced people who are a little elderly, so if those young generation who are more rooted in the philosophy and the principles of a particular tradition, they are more receptive to what the seniors are saying, superiors or elderly people are saying. And when they see the value in it, and when they apply in it, and when they teach to contemporary young generation, then the transformation is faster. So I would rather say there are 2 stages of transformations of youth which we have observed. Certain youths who are very rooted deeply in the tradition, they immediately accept from the elders when they see value and scientific basis in it. And then when these people, they go out to the next level of youths who are not so rooted in tradition and values, but they are more excited to take the movement of climate ahead. But when they see that even that the people of their own generation are taking it so seriously, and when they are communicated in a very proper, logical and scientific way, then they take it very fast. So I would say that in these 2 stages, the whole transformation happens very quickly. And also another thing is we have observed that there are 2 kind of youths. One are very radical in the sense they want to communicate, they want to spread things faster. And then there are others who may not be so radical, but they want to make changes. So we call it islands of excellence. That means you create a model example for an alternative model example for the community to follow. And when people, they see that that model is working and it is more beneficial from them than the existing model, then it makes tremendous change in their heart and they take it further forward. So this has been our experience at the Govardhan Ecovillage, where we have worked with the youth. First the youth started the whole thing, and then the youth started educating all the other nearby people and youths and whoever are the visitors. So things started spreading fast. So this was our experience working with the youth.
I would also just mention that I actually spoke recently together with a documentary filmmaker who's releasing next month a film about Greta Thunberg, and who, you know, is really now the new face of the global climate movement and has inspired millions of young people. In relation to the question, it's interesting because within Swedish society, there's even there's a difference of opinion. Some people are very supportive of her, but some people very much disagree with her, which is also the case in other societies. But I think it's very clear to young people that, you know, perhaps being young, there's less of a numbness to reality. And so when 98% of climate scientists say this is a do or die moment for humanity, you know, you can't just go back to watching the TV and ordering Pizza Hut. It's like, this is, if it's real, then a lot of young people are saying this is more important than reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they will walk out of school to show that that going to school is absurd in the face of the climate crisis. And so I also think it's a bit of a message to religion, because a lot of those young people care more about a thriving and sustainable planet than they do about theology and liturgy and homiletics. And if religion is going to be relevant for those millions of young people, then religion itself needs to wake up. If not for a sustainable planet, then at least for the sustainability of religion.
Well said. Sustainability of religion. I'm going to write that one down. That's a good one. We have 1 minute left, and this has gone so fast. I'm going to ask folks to stay on a little bit past what is noon my time, or past the hour, I should say, so that we can have one more person come on. And I'm taking these in order, and I want to apologize in advance to anyone who we didn't get to, which is a number of people. But really appreciate everyone, you know, engaging and wanting to join the conversation. And we will have more of these for sure. So stay tuned. But the last one we're going to take is David Takahashi.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to share the parable of the Good Samaritan. How interfaith is that? And if we were to consider that the victim lying in the road, beaten, stripped, and abandoned, is the earth itself, and how that would play in an interfaith perspective. And thank you for getting to me. And thank you for the wonderful hour and a half we've spent together.
Thank you. Thank you for that incredibly powerful image. It's really interesting to think about what's one of the most fundamental ideas in the Abrahamic tradition kind of being put on its head, and thinking about the earth being abused and our responsibility towards it rather than a fellow human. Very
how that applies beyond the Abrahamic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I had to read first before I could answer, so I had to go and do a little quick review. And I can see why you could see that story as an interfaith conversation, because when you do interplay the earth as the character that the people are walking past, it is a very powerful image of the ways in which we as people are finding reasons not to consider the earth as primary in terms of support. In this particular parable, both two religious groups of people, the priest and the Levite, walk right past a person who is in the middle of the road, who is beaten and naked, and does not help. And we see that, I think, playing out in our communities today. They're not just with climate change, but with social justice in general, and how there are certain communities that are more predisposed to more issues with social justice than others. And rooted in all of those things, I still believe fully, is the concept of climate change and the need for sustainability. And so I think it begs the question of, if we were to use that story as an interfaith conversation, in what ways would you consider using it? For me, I think of it, when I think of that story, I definitely think of how the person in the road is an interchangeable person. For me as a womanist, that person is a Black woman. Sometimes, particularly right now where we're seeing so many Black women and Black children being taken from schools and apartments and various places. I work at an institution in Greensboro, and we've had 3 people disappear, 3 students disappear from a van that was parked in their neighborhood. And so when I think of the story of the Good Samaritan, the first thing I think is, how many times have we driven past the van and never said anything? When I interplay that conversation into other components of social justice, there are so many things that we walk past every day, even in the midst of choosing whatever it is that the plight is that we're going to be focusing on. So there are lots of people who are focused. Like, one of the things I do when I read scripture is I don't just think about the person lying in the road, but I also think about the Levite and the priest. And ask myself, why would they walk past a naked, cold person in the street? As a woman, if I'm in a car with my kid and someone is on the side of the road stranded, I'm not going to get out of the car and help them, right? Because of my own safety. And I think about that when I think about how quickly we are to scapegoat or to villainize people for not necessarily having the ability and or the resources to stop by the side of the road and help a person. And so when I read the Samaritan scripture, it's not so much that the priest and the Levite were wrong for leaving the person in the road, so much as they may not have been equipped. And so for me, the story of the Good Samaritan isn't just about the Samaritan stopping for this person in the road, but more of a call for each of us to be capable of stopping for anyone, for creating an environment where we have the tools and the resources to be the Samaritan, so that we don't have to be the Levite who can't stop, and we don't have to be the priest that may or may not have been able to stop as well. And I think it's so quick to blame. For example, we're blaming these companies that we're divesting in without saying in our own accountability that they're here because we let them. You know, we're very quick to, talk about the earth as, the naked, stranded person. And while we're talking about that, we're literally doing it on a computer where technology is rooted in taking resources from mining in Africa to build these technological computers and phones and things that we're using, without saying, without some of these things, we wouldn't be able to even have this conversation like this right now. So I think there's a balance to the way that we read that story. We could take a lot out of it than just focusing on the naked person in the street. And what if that person in the street is really a mirror to the people that walk by? Could they not also be the person in the street that needed help as well?
Thank you. I think what you said about taking responsibility for recognizing our responsibility and our culpability in the crisis that we're in is an important process to go through if we're gonna ever do anything, if we're gonna ever move forward. Anyone have last thoughts among our conversationalists before we close? And last thoughts on that topic, or really anything.
I just give us a blessing that we should continue to work together in order to care for God's creation and manifest a thriving and livable planet for the next generation and all species.
And now that I've let someone take the first word, I have to tell you, I hope I have an opportunity to meet all of you in person, because your words really, really touched my heart. And I'm sure that if we were communicating directly without a computer, your energy would as well. So I look forward to keeping in touch, and thank you so much for making this possible.
Yes, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
I truly enjoyed this time. Thank you, guys.
Well, thanks to all of you for spending an hour and a half with us conversing informally, and thanks to everyone who joined us to listen and to engage as well. And we will have more global conversations, and I'm looking forward to the connections that we can make in the future. So for now, everyone have a great rest of the day and take care.